It was an ordinary night. The house was silent, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp and the distant sound of rain hitting the windows. Mike, my husband, was on yet another long workday. I was used to missing him, but that night I felt a different sensation. Lying on the bed with a glass of grape juice by my side, I looked for ways to mitigate the loneliness that insisted on expanding. I turned on the television, but soon noticed that the scenes were not capturing my attention. There was something deeper, an emptiness that seemed to demand to be filled. On an impulse, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time. Allow myself a moment of privacy. I put the juice aside and, almost mechanically, lay down. The comfortable sheets brushed my skin, and with the light from the television outlining the room, I began to investigate my body. It was a moment just for me, an attempt to alleviate the restlessness I carried. I closed my eyes and let my thoughts flow, allowing myself some comfort in the midst of that solitude. It was then that I heard a noise, a subtle sound, but enough to interrupt me. My heart raced, but I tried to convince myself that it was just the wood of the house creaking because of the rain. Still, a second sound, closer, made my entire body freeze. Before I could react, the bedroom door opened softly, revealing Jake, my godson. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes wide, clearly surprised. "Laura, is everything okay?" His voice was hesitant, but the surprise on his face revealed that he had seen more than he should have. Protected between the sheet and the shame, I tried to cover my body with whatever was within reach. My mind worked frantically, searching for words to divert his attention or disguise what he had witnessed. "Jake, My voice wavered, and the silence in the room seemed increasingly oppressive. He looked away quickly, but his hesitation was clear. "I just wanted to know if you were okay." The words sounded uncertain, but there was something in his tone that made my heart race even faster. As soon as he closed the door, I found myself isolated again, but I couldn't regain my focus. My body still pulsed, but no longer with the comfort it had felt before. It was something else, a mix of embarrassment and a realization I didn't want to acknowledge. That night had changed something, and no matter how hard I tried to rationalize what had happened, Jake's gaze remained in my mind. It wasn't just surprise. There was something else in his eyes, something I knew I shouldn't ignore. The days following that event were a combination of embarrassment and unease. Whenever I heard Jake's footsteps through the house, my heart would race, and I tried to avoid any direct interaction. I would pretend to be busy or leave the room as soon as he appeared. I wanted to believe it had been a mistake, that he would just let it go, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. Jake seemed changed, too. Once reserved, he now appeared frequently at times when he would normally prefer to keep his distance. While I was in the kitchen preparing the meal, he appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the doorframe, his arms crossed but his gaze fixed on me. "Laura, about that night," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. My entire body tensed. My fingers tightened on the dish towel, and I forced myself to keep my eyes on the stove, as if that were the only way I could maintain control. "We don't need to discuss this, Jake," I interrupted quickly, trying to sound reassuring. "It was just a misunderstanding, nothing more," I said, though I didn't sound convincing. "I know," he replied, taking a few steps closer. "I just wanted to say that I didn't mean to embarrass you." He was close enough now that I could smell his woody scent, a fragrance that seemed inappropriate for someone so young, but that suited him perfectly. His eyes, always so serene, now held something I couldn't name. I mumbled something about having already forgotten, but I couldn't look him in the eye. There was a brief silence, broken only by the sound of the pan on the stove. But then, in an even softer voice, he asked, "Did you really forget?" I turned around, unable to hide the shock in my expression. Looking at him was a mistake. There was something in his gaze that captured me, something that made my heart race in a way I didn't want to admit. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, trying to sound disinterested but failing miserably. He took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of submission. "Nothing. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. That's all." He left the kitchen, but he left behind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions that I couldn't organize. I knew I needed to maintain control, to set clear boundaries, but there was something about that exchange, about the intensity of his gaze, that made me uneasy. The next few days passed strangely. Jake was more present in the house, offering to help with simple tasks like carrying groceries or adjusting something that didn't even need fixing. His proximity was a constant reminder of what had happened, and although I tried to convince myself it was nothing, I knew something was changing between us. One night, while I was washing the dishes, he came into the kitchen again. This time, with a shy smile, but one that carried an unexpected confidence. "Can I help?" he asked, already rolling up his sleeves without waiting for my answer. I tried to protest, but he just smiled, picking up a plate and starting to dry it. We stood side by side, and as much as I tried to concentrate on the task at hand, I was aware of his every move, of his presence so close. "Do you feel isolated when my father is away so much?" he asked suddenly, his voice full of genuine concern. The question took me by surprise, and it took me a few seconds to answer. "Sometimes," I finally admitted, my voice low, "but it's part of the routine." He paused for a moment, the plate still in his hands, and looked directly at me. "If you need company, I'm here, you know?" Heat rose to my face, and I quickly looked away, focusing on the dishes. He didn't say anything else, but the weight of that sentence lingered in the air, a silent promise that I didn't know how to interpret. The following days were a constant challenge to my peace of mind. Avoiding Jake seemed impossible, especially since he seemed to always be around, as if he were waiting for me to give in. And somehow, I felt like I was getting closer and closer to doing so. One Friday night, after a hard day at work, Aaron announced that he had to go away again. Another weekend away, another time when I would be alone with Jake. The prospect of this situation made me anxious, but I tried to hide it. When Aaron left on Saturday morning, the tension in the air between Jake and me was palpable. He seemed hesitant, almost waiting for me to make the first move, but I remained resolute, keeping my distance, at least until that night. I was lounging on the couch in the living room with a glass of grape juice in my hand, trying to distract myself with a random movie. But every sound in the house seemed amplified, every step he took upstairs made my heart race. When he came down the stairs, I couldn't help but look up. He was barefoot, wearing a casual t-shirt and sweatpants, which made him look even younger and, at the same time, incredibly fascinating. He stopped in the middle of the room, his eyes fixed on me. "Can I sit?" he asked, his voice low, almost shy. I nodded, not trusting my own voice to answer. He sat down on the couch next to me, keeping a respectful distance, but even so, the proximity was enough to carry the air of something indescribable. "Laura," he began, but stopped, as if struggling to find the right words. "I know this is complex. I know you're trying to do the right thing." "It's not just complex, Jake, it's impractical," I interrupted, my voice sounding more confident than I expected. "This should never have happened." He sighed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I can't pretend this isn't happening." "Can you?" he asked, looking me in the eyes. "Can you pretend you don't feel anything?" My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to deny it, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the words just wouldn't come. He stepped closer, his expression serious, but his eyes betrayed the vulnerability he was trying to hide. "You're all I think about, Laura," he said, his voice cracking, but he didn't look away. I felt my heart pound wildly in my chest, as if each word he said was dismantling my defenses little by little. Before I could react, he lifted his hand, touching my face gently. "Tell me to stop and I'll stop," he said, his voice low but firm. I knew I should say it, knew I should push him away. But instead, I found myself tilting my head, allowing his touch to linger. He took my silence as permission, and before I could comprehend what was happening, his lips were on mine. Unlike the last time, this kiss wasn't it was indecisive. It was intense, full of desire and urgency, as if we had both been waiting for this for a long time. My hands instinctively went up to his shoulders as he pulled me closer. It was only when I felt his hands on my waist that reality hit me again. I pulled away abruptly, breathing hard. "This can't go on," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We need to stop." He didn't try to stop me, but the hurt in his eyes was evident. He nodded but said nothing, getting up from the couch and heading for the stairs. I stayed there alone in the living room, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions that was taking over me. That night, lying in bed, I realized that I was at a crossroads. Continuing with this would mean risking everything. My marriage, my reputation, my very serenity. But ignoring what I felt for Jake seemed equally impractical. Subscribe to the channel to see the rest of the story.